I was a mama's boy when I was growing up, in the most positive sense of the word. At least that's the way I look at it. I still have fond memories of growing up with a mom who I was very close to. Fond memories of being held and comforted in those moments when I needed it. I can still to this day remember her coming in, waking me up of a morning, and I would latch onto her neck and she would carry me into the kitchen by the heater until one day she finally said, "You know what, your high school buddy's outside, this is gonna look awkward." So I kind of quit doing it. Okay, it wasn't near that long, but I do remember also having a lot of long and deep conversations with Mom about Jesus, about the Bible, about God, about many other topics. Whatever came up, Mom was just who I talked to. So it was hard for me to say goodbye when she died 4 years ago. But as hard as it was for me to say goodbye to her, I know it was harder for her to say goodbye to one of her other sons 8 months prior to that, when we lost my brother Bob. Losing a child is always difficult, and as those of you who have experienced that loss, you know, no matter how old they are, it is always a difficult road to travel. And I remember during those times and those moments, Mom needing to kind of just leave the room as time was drawing near. I wonder if Mary, going back to when Jesus was just an infant and they took him to the temple and Simeon prophesied things about Jesus, the statement he made to Mary, I wonder if she ever comes back to that in this moment of time standing before a cross, when Simeon said, "A sword would pierce your own soul too." I wonder if she ever imagined that she would be standing at the foot of the cross watching Jesus and his soon-to-be sword-pierced body hanging there. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus, while hanging there in this tortured state, was still lucid enough, he was responsible enough, and even compassionate enough to make sure that his mother was being taken care of. And in the aftermath of his death, he wanted to make sure that she was going to be okay. And so while hanging there, he turns to his mother and he's looking down and says, "Woman, behold your son." In essence, he says, "Here's your son," talking about John, who was standing next to her. And then he looks at John and says, "Here's your mother." My first thoughts in this is why? Why, of all the sayings and the last words of Jesus that we have recorded, why this one? And why John? And not one of his brothers or one of the other disciples? Could this be that Jesus is just the oldest brother taking care of his mother? Or is there more to it? Well, why John maybe, and why is it recorded? Partly because John was the only one of the 12 that we know of that was even at the scene of the cross. He's the only one, at least, that recorded the words. Partly it was John because he was there and he was an eyewitness, and so he recorded these because he was privy to that conversation, because he was a part of it. That might be one reason. Why not one of his brothers, or at least one of Jesus's brothers, to be the one to take care of Mary? Well, at this point, they weren't believers in Jesus, or at least not in the fully follower sense of the word. And so maybe Jesus was wanting to just keep Mary within the confines of the spiritual family, and so choosing John was one way in which to do that. And so I remember Jesus making comment earlier about the one who does the will of his Father is the same as his mother and brother and sisters. So choosing John may have been one of the ways to keep Mary in this spiritual family. If you were to look at the other gospel writers and who they say is at the cross, when you compare all those together, it's most likely that John was actually a cousin of Jesus. And if that be the case, then in a sense, he would be sort of next of kin, and it was a way of Jesus keeping it in the family. That possibly could be. Perhaps it was because John was part of the inner circle, along with his brother James and Peter. They were the ones who would have had more of the intimate conversations with Jesus. And so maybe having those closer conversations, Jesus knew he could rely upon one of those three. Some people think that John was the closest of all of them to Jesus, partly because he described himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I don't really think that John's superiority or relational hierarchy there, that he was kind of putting that out as I'm closer than anybody else. In fact, he was writing over a half century later when he writes these words. I think he's just describing and remembering how much Jesus loved him. In fact, if you take note of his first letter of John, he writes a lot about love. So I don't know if that's why, but maybe John was one of the closer ones, potentially. Another question I have is, knowing that this was about to take place, why didn't Jesus just have the conversation the night before in the garden? But perhaps maybe he had already had that conversation. Maybe they had had a conversation in private, and he wanted to make sure that John was there. And while others ran away, John found a way to stick around because he knew this was coming. And he wanted to make sure that Mary would be taken care of and would not be at the scene when it finally came to the end. For you see also, when you look at the other gospel writers and they list the women at the cross, none of them list Mary as being there, only John. And so it's most likely that after this conversation, John took Mary home from that point on. And one last thought maybe on that is maybe God was just letting us in on one final private conversation with Jesus and his mother. Those few moments that would have just been a precious, holy moment. Maybe this is like a diamond. Maybe the reason isn't one, but it's multifaceted. You know, when you look at a diamond and you turn it, every time you turn it, it looks a little bit different, the way the light hits it and the prisms and the colors. And so the reasons may be many, the reasons may be few, or may be unknown and we don't know at all. But one thing we need not overlook, that in this big moment, the little was not overlooked. While Jesus was involved in the macro part of the world, he was concerned about the micro. While Jesus was saving the world, being the sacrifice for the sins of all mankind, the past, the present, and those yet to be born, he was still taking care of his mother. In this big and wide world, in these big moments, Jesus cared about the little. Jesus cared about those he loved. And we see the heart of Jesus, even in that moment, under high, extreme stress, facing imminent death and the ridicule that was happening all around him. Jesus showed us his heart. You may think that God has bigger fish to fry, that there's more important things for God to do and people to take care of. There's more impressive people that he needs to tend to, or maybe more desperate. in this big and wide world that we live in, God cares about your small and little village. I remember Peter's words when he says, "Cast all your cares on him because he cares for you." And I like to think that when I gave my life to Jesus, that he not only looks after and takes care of me, but one day he will bring me to the Father and say, "Here is your son."